The one thing, especially with children, though, is because we talk about toxins and environment and stuff. But for children in neurodevelopmental disorders, the most important environment you will ever be exposed to is those 9 months in your mother's belly. Okay? And this is something I think is underappreciated. And this is what we're trying to do, is that we find a lot of these things that we find in children, which sometimes, becomes to adults, become adults. So we find those in mom. And it's underappreciated, right? And if we can start to combat that stuff at that critical time when the child's growing, then we can give the child a path of a lack of chronic disease. And it's not only autism, but, we know things like the microbiome, which is those trillions of bugs that are in your intestine. They're actually doing something, and we know that if that doesn't get set up right, it sets you up for chronic disease in childhood.
Welcome to Metabolic Matters podcast. Let's meet today's guest.
Gosh, you guys, this is a really, really amazing conversation we're about to have with someone who caught my attention several years ago. Dr. Richard Frye, pediatric neurologist and one of the most prolific, researchers and publishers in the field of autism spectrum disorder, and particularly in the realm of how it relates to mitochondrial dysfunction, metabolic abnormalities, as well as neuroinflammation. And my gosh, you published dozens, if not hundreds, of peer-reviewed publications, even with your input of the research, but also even insights into some integrative approaches in the autism space. And you've really been on the forefront of linking some of the mitochondrial dysfunction and abnormal energy metabolism, and the link around focusing on kind of the behavioral as well as cognitive manifestations of autism, and maybe some other ways in which we're thinking about this and approaching it. And finally, I know you've done a lot of interesting research and even the nutritional realms of this, and how we can even harness nutrition as a mitochondrial target and mitochondrial treatment, including things like carnitine and folate and antioxidant treatments, which I'm hoping you touch on for our listeners today. But my gosh, you are a busy man doing a lot of things and bringing a lot of hope to a lot of families across the globe. So welcome, Dr. Richard Frye.
Wow, that was a wonderful introduction.
What did I get it right? There's so much to say about you.
Well, that's probably one of the best introductions I've had. So yeah, I really appreciate it.
Perfect. Well, you are it's funny. I speak at a lot of conferences around the globe, mostly cancer-centric. Almost all of them have some discussion around mitochondrial health. And whenever your name is brought up, everyone seems to know you. It's incredible. If you say mitochondria, you have to think Dr. Frye, I think, in the world of research today. So tell us how you ended up in this space. How did you end up in the space of mitochondrial medicine as well as autism in general?
Yeah. Well, in general, overall is just looking for treatments for kiddos. The real way that I, ended up in it is, I like to say, autism found me. So I was very interested in learning disabilities. And I did a fellowship in learning disabilities and behavioral neurology. And it was just about that time that autism is a little after the 2000, about 2003, 2004. And, autism was being more and more recognized. This is when we started to really recognize it and take it seriously. And of course, being a neurologist, they don't teach you a lot about autism, but, since I was like the behavioral person, they figured, that I knew something. And of course, there was the fellow. So when patients would come in with their kids with autism, they say, well, where do we send it? And they said, well, nobody really knows. Why don't we let the fellow deal with this one? You
were like, just put him on my plate instead. Yeah.
And so they had all these parents coming to me saying, they've told me my kid has autism. They don't know really what to do about it except some educational, behavioral therapies, and they don't know what causes it. And maybe it has something to do with the brain. So maybe you can help me out. So at that point, we were doing some stuff. Where I was at was looking at different types of seizure disorders that look like autism. So that's something I could do, was I could do an EEG. So I knew how to do that. And then I started to learn that these kids have some metabolic disorders, some mitochondrial disorders. And it just happened that I had some interest when I was in pediatrics in mitochondrial disorders. I had fallen, I was lucky enough to, my second month as an intern, diagnose a kid with a pyruvate dehydrogenase complex deficiency. I was working
even
down.
one of those in our practice. That's rare. Yeah,
it is. But the great thing, at med school, I applied to go to Miami for my pediatrics because I knew, that's one of the busiest hospitals, in the country. And all of Latin America would fly into Miami and they just walk into the emergency room. And so the rare disorders I got to see were absolutely amazing, But it brought me back to my, kind of pediatrics. Said, oh yeah, I'm interested in mitochondrial disorders. And that's something I know how to diagnose. So I could put that on the plate. Now we got two things. I can diagnose seizures, mitochondrial disorders. And then I left residency. And then every job I got, first I went to University of Florida, and then especially I went to University of Texas. But the same thing happened is that all these kids with autism were coming to the neurology department. And nobody knew anything really. So as soon as my colleagues found out, oh, you know something about autism? They said, I got a whole clinic of them. You can have them all. And so that's what all I was seeing. And that's when I made my first, what I call the medically based autism clinic, to look at it from a whole point of view,
Wow.
And I didn't know where it was going to take me, actually. But I was in Houston at UT Houston. And of course, these guys are cowboys, So, not really, So when a kid wasn't developing, we didn't have an answer. They did the $1 million workup. We did lumbar puncture and overnight EEGs, scans, and everything. And that's when I started to notice, in the lumbar puncture, that their chemistry was not right.
Mm-hmm.
My first trial, I noticed that there was something called tetrahydrobiopterin, which is very important for nitric oxide metabolism, for neurotransmitters, phenylalanine metabolism. That was low, and I just happened to stumble on to a drug rep that was promoting something called Kuvan, which is the commercial formulation. And so they let me do my first clinical trial. And then we started to realize that there was this folate story, which really just took off. Yeah, that was pretty amazing. But along the way, it was one of these things where, okay, I had EEGs, you had mitochondrial, you had folate, so these things started to add up. Even if you say like, oh, this is a small percent here, this is a small percent here. But once you start to add it up, it comes to real numbers, and you find that there's a lot of kids that you can help. So of course, I got into this. I was very interested, and there is a bit of a bias that autism isn't really medical, especially back then. So the only people that would listen to me are the integrative medicine people.
So it is still today. And this, what year again, Doc, was this? Was this early 2000s?
This is early 2000s, yeah. So this was when I was at Texas. I went to Texas, I think, 2006.
Okay.
So from 2006 to 2011, I think I was there. Yeah, so that's when the folate story started to take off. And that was pretty amazing, in the sense that, I had seen a kid with low folate, and my a colleague, we used to have, it was a really good program. We'd have grand rounds every week where either the residents or, the medical students would present a case. They presented a case of cerebral folate deficiency. And, that was really described just at 2005. So that was just at the beginning, brand new. And I said, well, maybe that's what this kid has. And I treated one of my first kids, I treated with leucovorin. And he went from this kid that was just in the corner, not interacting with his family, just doing these stereotype movements, to a kid and having seizures, to not having seizures, to interacting, to become part of the family. I mean, not all of his autism went away, but he became a kid that was interactive, that could be part of the family.
Wow, big quality of life difference. And for the listeners, just to define, you've thrown out some really amazing things that you and I can groove on, but specific to this folate piece, this leucovorin piece, you alluded to this, these other metabolic derangement pieces. Can you speak a little bit to defining maybe high level methylation, mitochondrial function, and maybe the role of folate in general before people start to put the dots together themselves for the autism?
So, I'll just give you a little bit more of an overview, and then we'll go back. And so, so then, when this started to become, a greater thing, is that Jill James, who, had, discovered the methylation and the redox abnormalities in kids with autism, was at Arkansas Children's Hospital. And I met her at one of these, integrative medicine places, and she had found that, so Arkansas Children's Hospital had come into the, if you remember back then, we had the cigarette money that, so they had all this money that they wanted to do something. One was creating an autism program. So she said, why don't you come and check it out and see? And that's when I moved to Arkansas. And I was able to go from just looking at mitochondrial disorders clinically to actually getting my first wet lab, and just having great people, that I still work with today.
Well known for it and well loved for it, of being both. You started out as bedside to the bench, and then you morphed into the bench to the bedside, and your worlds have been entangled ever since.
Exactly. And so, and then, from there, I went to Phoenix Children's, and now I think we have a nice setup of taking off those reins of academia, and kind of streamlining this. And that's kind of what we want to do, is really find what the answers are with not a lot of constraints that are put down as far as, with bureaucracy and such, because we really have to move this stuff forward. It's not just science for science sake. This is work to really try and find out how we can help these kids that need things now.
Yeah, Richard, the thing I think is so amazing about you is, and not, unfortunately, you think this would be a common finding in clinicians, but I'm surprised that it's not more common, which is one of curiosity, one of being a good observer, one of, you started putting some dots together early on in your career, all the way back in Florida, and just kind of morphing with, okay, another layer of information. And then you got to Texas, and a few more pieces came together. And then your willingness to engage with, really hear the pain points of the parents, see these children in duress, and meet someone who has the financial means to actually research it in a meaningful way to find out what can we do like that. Why do you think that's not more common among our colleagues?
It's hard.
Yeah.
But it's one of these things, I put it to, a lot of things, being from New York, New Yorkers are tough. We learn to go through things that are hard. Everything is a challenge, and then like it, So
with a smile on your face or a grumble in your step.
I've always liked challenges, but I think there's different types of medicine, and neurology, child neurology is really good. I think in the sense that it's kind of even behind where neurology is. So you have to ask these questions. It's very complicated. I always like to say child neurology is like being a super pediatrician, because the brain really affects everything, and everything affects the brain. And there's a lot of metabolism in it. There's a lot of development. So you have all these different aspects that you have to learn and integrate. So, it's really, if you want to be a good child neurologist, you have to learn all these pieces, which is a challenge, but it's good. But then the other thing that I think was really important is the time I kind of grew up in residency in child neurology. There wasn't, it still isn't, but there weren't a lot of drugs that were approved for children. So the idea of using drugs off-label to treat was almost everything we did.
Wow.
And a lot of doctors aren't used to that. They're used to, saying, well, this is the indication, this is what I'm going to use. But we didn't have that, right? We had to use things off-label. So when it came to using off-label drugs for things that would work, it was second nature to me, And so I don't think that that's second nature to a lot of, doctors, that they kind of look at those different boxes. And that, and there's good and bad parts of it. It creates efficiency, and you have to know when to use it, So, when I go into the clinic, I have a certain type of protocol, right? I have my head, to try and get where I need to go. And that's good, so I can get that done and then also get my research done at the same time,
Amazing. So, a question, I know this question comes up everywhere, at every conference, at every family, like autism, family-based organization, foundation, etc. The conversations out there are so stuck in the loop of what is the single cause and what is the single cure.
Right.
And you, in pulling back from that and looking more at these pathways, have been able to understand more endpoints that may not be just a single cause or cure, maybe a collection of things. Can you speak to that? Because I think that keeps you out of trouble, and why you're so loved and respected is because you're very careful about being sensationalistic or very specific about it's definitely this one thing and it's definitely this one treatment. And so maybe start with that and then weave back in the folate conversation, because there's probably a few people on the edge of their seats going, what? Where does that come in? But I think you sharing about your perspective on this might help people start to put the dots together themselves.
Right. And, and that's the thing. I remember one patient, that didn't come back for follow-up, and I finally came back and I asked them why I should come back. And they said, well, you didn't give me the autism pill. And so that's how we think of things, right? There's a pill for things. So you just give the autism pill. There's one cause for things. And that's not what we're seeing, and this is true when we think of systems biology. It's not this piece is broken or this piece is broken. It's how these things are working together, And so with that, there's many ways to get to that point. And then when that happens, there's not just one thing to fix. You have to, go from all angles. And then that's what, and it's different in everybody. So it's so individual, And so, and this is what we tell parents, right, is that it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. Because there are some kids that respond very quickly and recover very quickly, but for the most part, that's not the rule. And you really have to be very delicate and play around with many things and push many buttons from many sides to see, what's going to work and what isn't. And we don't have the science to tell us where those weak parts are. Now, we have some of it, and that's what we try and do. The first thing I try to do is, do those tests that will say, okay, you go in this box, you go in this box. But there's no real boxes. You have a little this and you have a little that. But you can get, to the end of that pretty quick. And, we only have, so much of that. And then you have to start, trying different things and use your intuition to figure that out. And so, we like to describe it as the terrible trio, which I think we see in a lot of different diseases, right? In a lot of chronic diseases, including cancer, right? You see the mitochondrial dysfunction, the oxidative stress, and the inflammation. We call it neuroinflammation, so in the brain, but it's all that same thing. And if you look at those pathways, they negatively reinforce each other. Once one goes down too far, it brings the other ones down. And then there's no easy way to pull them up, or to know where that started, to know where the weak spot is. So I think that's one of the things. It's not just one of those, but it's all of these things together. And then addressing them, trying to find out where those weak spots are to bring them in. And of course, as you say, diet, and everything. One of the major themes is that you have to have a healthy body. right? You're not going to get to where you're going to want to be without a healthy body, because when you have a weak system, every little thing is going to bring it down. So that's where it's so important to look at nutrition and vitamins and exercise and all these type of things to make the body healthy.
Huge. So, Doc, in your research, because you've been all over, you've had the benefit of being in the clinical bedside of things, seeing kids in real time with their families, even in their environments, their own natural living environments. So you've had that, and then you've had the luxury of going deep inside the cell, even inside the cells, the organelles, the organs within the cells, to look at this. Can you speak to some of the common findings? Like you spoke to the trifecta of basically inflammation, metabolic or mitochondrial dysfunction. So just the way we use our energy levels, and the
Incremental.
Yeah, exactly. So with that piece, like, can you give some examples of what might kick up those terrible three on the superficial side of what you're seeing clinically? Like, what is the tangible thing that parents can start to become aware of? Might be that. And then on the lab level, like in the bench side, looking inside those cells, have you discerned certain patterns or findings within that?
Yeah. I mean, definitely all of the above. So, first of all, any type of stress on the body, we want the body, any type of just, very poor quality food.
Yeah.
So I would say that you have your bad stuff that brings you down. And on the other side, you have the not good enough stuff that brings you down.
Interesting.
So poor quality food does two things. If it's not made from, good things or has things that may cause stress to the body, you're going to stress the body, oxidative stress, poor mitochondrial function and such. But also it doesn't include the nutrition.
Right. Factors required. Right.
Right. So those systems that would combat all this bad stuff now are brought down because they don't have their nutrients to actually combat that. So it becomes a double whammy,
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, we have water. We need to, make sure you drink clean water, breathe clean air, eat good food. All of these things, are really, really important. But, the one thing, especially with children, though, is because we talk about toxins and environment and stuff. But for children and neurodevelopmental disorders, the most important environment you will ever be exposed to is those 9 months in your mother's belly.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And this is something I think is underappreciated. And this is what we're trying to do, is that we find a lot of these things that we find in children, which sometimes, becomes to adults, they become adults. So we find those in mom.
Yeah.
And it's underappreciated, right? And if we can start to combat that stuff at that critical time when the child's growing, then we can give the child a path of a lack of chronic disease. And it's not only autism, but, we know things like the microbiome, which is those trillions of bugs that are in your intestine. They're actually doing something, and we know that if that doesn't get set up right, it sets you up for chronic disease in childhood. So,
well, it's interesting. I was at a medical conference this weekend, and it was an autoimmune conference for conventional medical doctors, some of them with a bit of a functional or integrative medicine mindset, but most of them pretty conservative, and most of them hearing some of these concepts for the first time. And there were a few points that stand out that I'm curious of your thoughts on. I have a feeling what they'll be, but I think the audience would like to hear straight on. I mean, first of all, remember that our mitochondria within our bodies, our generation, what generates our energy, our life, really, that can make up upwards of 20% of our body composition, and they've evolved from bacteria. So when you think about that alone, and you think about the vast amounts of antibiotics we poured into our soil, our soil system to grow the foods that then feed the animals that then feed us, you realize there's a bunch of antibiotics through that way. And then we're often given a lot of antibiotics, like mom often, if there's a sign of an infection at the time of childbirth, she's given antibiotics then. So I'd love for you to maybe take a moment, because that was a big one, a big aha for people to realize, wow, like you said, that within the first 2 years of life, those 9 months in gestation, as well as the first 2 years of life when we're first starting to mature our immune system, the exposures to even just antibiotics in any form coming in might have a ping in the system. Do you see that in your research? Is that something you could speak to confidently?
Almost definitely. Not only, so there's a lot of medicines that we use, a little cavalier during pregnancy that affect the mitochondria, and then of course, acetaminophen, of course, is, it's a toxin in the sense that it's bad for the mitochondria, and that it prevents us from creating glutathione, the major antioxidant of our body it's important for detoxification. So, a little bit might not be that bad, but it's kind of preached that, oh, that's the go-to medicine, in pregnancy. And that's when I had a friend that was a researcher that did maternal health, especially in pregnancy. And he would question, he looked to try to survey what medications and drugs and such, mothers would take. And he said that even though many moms would not say that they took acetaminophen, every single urine sample he had acetaminophen in it.
Interesting. So maybe from our public water source, or maybe they were taking it without even thinking
they were taking it without even thinking of it, because it's in every single medication.
You're right.
And there's a story.
Blah, blah, blah. Yeah. Pain medicines. Yeah.
And that's a story. I have a book on NAC, on N-acetylcysteine in medicine. And I had one of the first researchers that researched NAC, from Stanford. She wrote the foreword, and she puts the story in there about, how there was a child that came, little girl that came in with liver failure, 5 years old. They brought in for the grandparents, and they didn't exactly know why. And then they realized that the grandparents she was sick, so they just kept giving her all types of medications, all types of over-the-counter medications, enough to actually affect her liver, because we just don't think of this, so that's just one example. But, SSRIs can also, of course, you said antibiotics, many other medicines. Then lack, the other thing that's really important, that's easy, is vitamin D levels have been, correlated with autism and other diseases.
Meaning low levels of D3?
Low levels during pregnancy, low iron, The other thing, is that carnitine, which is an extremely important vitamin, for fatty acid oxidation. It goes down and you talk to some people, some, OBs, and they say, oh yeah, that's how it is. Well, that is how it is, but maybe we have to do something about it now that we're finding that these things can actually affect the health. One of the common themes, with these, metabolic abnormalities and mothers during pregnancy, some of the common themes is that there seems to be some disorders of fatty acid oxidation.
Yes.
And so that's where carnitine comes in. And so we probably should be getting extra carnitine,
right. Right. Well, and that's the interesting thing. So just so listeners know, carnitine, think of it as the bus that carries this fat across the membrane into the mitochondria to create energy. And so to also help induce apoptosis, so kill off things that shouldn't be there, to help regenerate new tissues, to help, just charge the battery of the system. And if there's a deficiency of that, either in a single nucleotide polymorphism hiccup kind of way, or just a malnourishment, because our needs, as you noted, are changed during pregnancy and lactation, delivery and lactation. But the other big trend in the last 20, 30 years has been a really big, and this isn't to bash the vegans or the vegetarians, but we've really done a job helping people, or having people believe that this is a better diet for our planet, which is one conversation, but no one's really doing the investigation to see the detriment that it can have in our bodies. And one of those is a tremendous deficiency in vitamin D that you just alluded to. A lot of times iron, because we're also getting those from the heme of animal protein, and specifically the carnitine, which is coming from especially red meat. So could you speak to that, of just some of the food sources of things like the folate you mentioned, the carnitine, the iron, some of those, what are the best sources for those from our diet, not necessarily from a supplement?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Going to one way or another, there's a big, a push for plant-based diets, which I think is good. They tend to be, anti-inflammatory, but you have to do everything in moderation, so meats, especially, grass-fed, very good high quality meats, in limited portions are very, very good. And they give us those balanced nutrients. And that's what our body has been designed to do. We think we're smarter than our body, but we're not, so we have to definitely, look at our different diets and what the positive and negatives are. And as you say, meats, that's where we get carnitine from. Looking at that is going to be very, very important to design your diet. And if you want to stay on that, you have to take the supplements that are going to supplement your body. But it's very important to understand that, as doctors, we know we get a CBC and a CMP, and that's it. You don't understand there's all these other things that are going on that we don't necessarily learn about in medical school that can have very important effects.
Right. Well, I think even that, like you have a particular set of metrics you like to look at in the human, but also a set of metrics you like to look at basically under the microscope, or in your situation, the seahorse. Could you talk about what are the tangibles we can run, like from a lab of urine, saliva, blood, stool, that might be giving you clues to the health or disease states of your little patients, and perhaps the same to what you find in the lab, the wet lab chemistry?
Yeah. So one of the problems is that your standard. So there are some standard tests that we can run in medicine that can give us some information about fatty acid oxidation, how our fats are. So simply how our fats are being processed. Is there a block stopping those fats? Measures of mitochondrial function, things like lactate and such, which tell us, if the mitochondria is working. So, and you can the way I explain it is, we use sugars, right? And we can get some energy from sugar, but then to get that optimal energy, that sugar has to go into the mitochondria. And that last step is these certain things that we can measure: pyruvate, lactate, alanine. And those are the things that go in there as the last step. So if the mitochondria isn't working, these things are going to be elevated in the blood. So you can think of it very simply like that.
Like backing up, it's not getting to where it needs to be.
Right. Think of that there's a block. Somebody put, a roadblock there, and now they're getting back up, like getting backed up in traffic.
Totally. Great.
And so in some ways it's that simple, but of course there's other subtleties too. And that's what we have to start to learn, so we kind of understand it as these kind of blocks and what might be elevated, but then we're finding that it is more complex. So in the mitochondria, in fact, what we found, when we first started, doing mitochondrial work, we thought that it would be easy, of course, but this is science, right? So we said we have this thing called the seahorse, as you said. This is a machine that measures mitochondrial function. And it'll be easy. We could go to the biorepository, the NIH, Autism Speaks biorepository, and get some cells from kids with autism and get some cells from, typically developing. I'll put them in the seahorse, and there seems to be something with the mitochondria in these kids with autism. So, we'll see these blocks in it, and the mitochondria won't be working well. And then, so we put them in there and go, yeah, we know it's going to happen. And what happened? The exact opposite.
Yeah.
And this is how you discover things in science. And, everybody thinks traditionally mitochondrial disease is when the mitochondria isn't working. But what we found is that there was something very, very different going on, and this is what we see a lot in science and medicine. Everybody's saying, oh, this is the way it goes. It's always there. They never look at the other side or the other subtleties of it. And what we found is that there was actually there's a significant, subtle but significant increase in mitochondrial function. So we said, how could that be?
Hyperactive mitochondrial
That's right.
process. Opposite of most other chronic illnesses, this is what you taught me, is the difference between this and cancer, for instance, is almost directly opposite. So super fascinating. Please carry on.
Right. And that's what's very interesting is so autism, they turn on the mitochondria. Cancer, you turn off the mitochondria, and for very different reasons, and so we were able to, show that over and over and over again. Of course, people didn't believe it, and there's people that still don't believe it. But, we did a dozen, replicated in our cells, a dozen times and did some other experiments. And then we showed in people's cells it happens to, and then we showed in fibroblasts it happens to. So, you show it over and over again. And recently what we did is we've linked it to neurodevelopmental regression, which actually makes a lot of sense because what we found is that when these mitochondria, and you can think of this, they're running 200% of normal. It's like a race car, right? Wow. If you're in a race car
on blocks,
yeah,
not getting anywhere. Yeah.
Right, exactly. But if you're in a race car, right, you have a speed bump, right? If you're going slow, and you go over the speed bump, it's no problem. If you're in a race car and you go over a speed bump, boom, right?
It's like Dukes of Hazzard.
Exactly.
Wow.
And so what we found is that when it's racing at 200% of normal, then any little thing makes it fall down and turn off or lose all of its energy. So this is kind of a model we found early on. We thought of neurodevelopmental regression, where you have this thing compensating, the mitochondria is compensating for some reason by working really hard. And then what happens, a little stress comes along and it falls down. And that's what you would think of as neurodevelopmental regression, of your brain turning off, not being able to work, losing skills. And it's only recently that we've actually clinically linked it to neurodevelopmental regression in those patients. So
I'm really intrigued by this because you're talking. So if I think about what you just described, the input of the world around us, the toxins, the wrongful diets, the wrongful light exposures, the poor quality of air and water, the stressors that you talked about earlier on that can put some burden or input into those mitochondria. In most mitochondrial diseases, of which cancer is one of those expressions, it turns them off. And
right.
In autism, you're saying it upregulates them. And so have you identified what the doorway is for it to say, do I want to go here or do I want to go here? Have you identified roughly or getting some ideas around what that?
What we're getting some ideas that it's that what's happening is it's a failure of some of the compensatory systems to regulate oxidative stress. So kind of the other story, as we were talking about the terrible trio, we know that kiddos with autism, they have these high levels of oxidative stress, or at least a depletion in glutathione.
Okay.
So glutathione is the major antioxidant of our body.
Right. They might have the same amount of oxidative stress, but they don't have the cleanup crew to deal with it.
Exactly. And so then that can cause, again, it's kind of a vicious cycle where then if you have too much oxidative stress, then it causes damage, and that damage causes more damage, and you can't control it. And for some reason, they're not making the glutathione. And we're starting to talk about it as a glutathione deficiency syndrome.
Interesting.
Because it's not only probably autism, there's a lot of disorders, especially chronic diseases, where there's so much oxidative stress, and the liver, which usually makes the glutathione, isn't working, and you have this lack of glutathione. But what happens is you have this high level oxidative stress. So how do you deal with it?
Right.
So we found sometimes there's certain pathways that actually turn on compensatory systems for oxidative stress. But we actually found in one study that for some reason, these kids with this really overfunctioning mitochondria, they're not turning on those pathways. So it seems like the mitochondria is finding this as another way to compensate for that high level of oxidative stress. And what we're seeing is, what you can think of it is like anything, when you push a system is, well, it's starting to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And then it gets to a certain point and it can't do it anymore. And it just falls apart, right? It's like driving your car and having your tachometer go into the red, right? It's like you're pushing. At a certain point, your engine blows up.
And so this process doesn't just happen once. It's not like you push, collapse, and then it's over. It's like the body keeps trying to compensate and push, collapse, push. So why you might see, for instance, a kiddo kind of holding their own for a little bit or pretty much stable and then have down. Like those are the moments you're talking about is push, collapse when they were seemingly cruising along a little bit better than usual.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we actually, we see this a lot. I mean, some kiddos where we see, because the mitochondria is also important for the immune system.
Yeah.
So one of the signs, if you not have mitochondria that work well, is you get a lot of illnesses. Right. Yeah. And so we find there's this vicious cycle where, the mitochondria isn't working. You get an illness. The illness pulls everything down, then you have to heal up very slowly. So that's one of the things that we look for in kids with mitochondrial dysfunction is, one, recurrent infections of unknown reason, and two, taking longer to get over injections. And you hear that from parents. The kid takes, compared to the other kids, it takes weeks and weeks and weeks to get over it,
And are you finding in your research, because again, at this conference this weekend, one of the things that was the aha, like you've alluded to vitamin D deficiency, and you've alluded to some gut issues, but one thing I was learning is that, again, any amount of antibiotics, even any amount basically of glyphosate, we've even found that certain viruses, specifically HHV6, Epstein-Barr, and even SARS-CoV, will downregulate specifically the bifidobacterium of the microbiome, which is the most prevalent gut organism. In fact, bifidus is pretty much the only gut microorganism in a baby and toddler's gut until after the age of 2. And so it's also what primes the immune system to know what to do in the future. So it looks to me like there's this sort of vulnerable window, as you alluded to, 9 months in the belly, and maybe the first 2 years, that the accumulative effect of some of these things that could impact our D3 levels, impact our redox pathways, impact our gut microbiome, where a lot of that immune signaling takes place. Are you doing some research in the microbiome space with this and seeing some of these interesting patterns as well?
We are. Yeah. I mean, we've, been lucky to collaborate with Jim Adams at ASU.
Amazing,
who's, piloting, or developing really microbiome transfer therapy, formerly known as fecal transplants. We got a little bit better name from that.
Yeah.
But in our last study, we finished the adult study with, to be released soon, the data. But it's very promising, and we're looking at all these metabolic systems, and it's very clear that the metabolic systems are being modulated, by, the microbiome. Now, we've done some studies in the laboratory in our seahorse where we've looked at short-chain fatty acids.
Very cool. Yeah.
And so, we're very big on that. So propionic acid bad, butyrate good. How do you get those levels up? That's the magic question. Yeah.
So interesting. So what therapies have you found? I mean, you've alluded to a bunch. You've kind of talked about some off-label drugs, a few nutrients, a few kind of dietary interventions. Do you have kind of your top 3 go-tos that you advise parents or caregivers to offer up for their kiddos? That you just see it time and again seems to be at least a good starting point.
Yeah. So B12, folate, most important things that you can have. And so we've had a lot of success.
The form matters. Maybe speak a little bit to that. The form.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So, that's the really amazing thing. And it shows you how important but subtle these things are, is that for folate, done a lot of work on folate. And of course, our work has found that coming off the work of Dr. Quattro's and Dr. Rainmaker's, that there's a problem with getting folate into the nervous system. So as I said, back then when I was in Texas, we could do LPs. I mean, I could still do LPs, but it's a lot to go through.
Right. And LPs, for people who don't know that acronym?
Sorry, it's called a lumbar puncture or spinal tap, where you put, and people are scared of it. It's actually, we know how to do it very well. And if you, use the right amount of numbing medicine, it doesn't really hurt, but it's a lot to go through. Take a needle and you put it through the, between the two vertebrae, and you put it into the sac that has the fluid. It's below where the brain has ended, where the spinal cord has ended. So not going to hurt anything. And then you take that fluid out, but it's a lot to go through. So, you can do it, if you need to, but, we don't really want to do that. And that's what we, were able to develop. We found the biomarker that helps us with that.
Folate was at that time the biomarker that gave you a clue of the importance of the nutrient.
Exactly. So we found that folate was low in that spinal fluid, so low in the brain. And this was found by Dr. Rainmakers in about 2002, which, is like a blink of the eye in medicine, right? And he didn't know why. Of course, he thought, well, it must be genetic. And he sequenced the genes of the major transport mechanism, the folate receptor alpha, it's called, and he found there was nothing wrong. And it's a really interesting story, because at the same time, Dr. Quatros at SUNY Downstate was doing research, but on neurotube defects. So those are birth defects.
Yep.
And that's caused by folate not getting into the fetus. It ends up the same folate transporter is also on the placenta. So he was doing that research, and then Dr. Rainmaker said, "Oh, I have these kids with low folate. Could it be this antibody?" And they got together, and really it took off that we found, well, if you have this antibody, then it stops folate from getting into the brain. And we were able to first, when we were doing lumbar punctures, spinal taps, we were able to correlate the antibody with how much was getting into the nervous system to know. And then we said, well, now we're confident enough that we can use the blood test and leave that test where we had to do the spinal tap behind. And then myself and my colleague, Dr. Rosignol, realized this was a thing. And we just said, well, why don't we find out how many kids in our clinic might have this antibody? And we did our first study, and we found that 75% of the kids with autism had this antibody. So really, really big numbers. So that's what led us to our first open label clinical trial and a double-blind clinical trial. And find that for some kids, you just give a simple type of folate called leucovorin that can go around this block. And this is where, as you said, there's different types of folates, and this is very important, because what we think, everybody thinks of folic acid. That's what's in all our vitamins. It's fortified in our food. And so it's a very stable form of folate. It's a very expensive form. So that's why it's used. You can fortify all the food with it, but it's synthetic, which means it's not natural to our body. And our body can process it and make it bioactive. But what we're learning is that it can only do so much. So with folic acid, more is not better necessarily. Some is good. We know that it prevents neurotube defects during pregnancy. It reduces the risk of autism during pregnancy at the normal doses. But then some people have some problems with folate pathway and they need more. So what do? So they say, oh, give more folic acid. Now we're finding out, no, because what happens is the body can only transform so much, and we get a buildup of something called unmetabolized folic acid, which actually increases the risk of autism.
Exactly.
So it's same, exactly. So it's very confusing, because the same nutrient that decreases the risk of autism increases it also if given at high doses. But this isn't true of the bioactive folates. So leucovorin goes right into the folate cycle. 5-methotetrahydrofolate goes right into the folate cycle. And the studies have shown that for the most part, you can give as much as you want of these, and they're not going to do anything bad to the folate cycle. And of course, we love B vitamins. Folate is vitamin B9 because it's water soluble, which means you pee it out at the end of the day. So the worst thing you could do is make expensive pee.
Nice. Well, and I want to point out, you mentioned about the fortification process. And to your point, I've also heard statistics of upwards of 75% of the population can't properly utilize excess synthetic folic acid. So that is interesting. And it's wild because a lot of these kiddos and a lot of kids in general are really being raised on very highly ultra processed food today, which by nature, or I should say unnature, is often very fortified, right, with folic acid. And so if these kids are eating any food basically from factories, not truly from the source food sources, and they're drinking fortified milk products, dairy products, grain products, they are the ones who are very vulnerable to it overshooting and moving into that aberrant pathway you described. So I just want to put that out there, why food matters and why getting these kids onto as least processed food as possible. So we can avoid that concern that you're talking about, the over-fortified folic acid form of this, which will worsen these kiddos' outcomes. So I think that was just a really interesting side note. So I appreciate you taking us there. What other maybe 2 offerings would you have that parents should really consider bringing in to their household?
So we know B12 is so important. One, it works with folate. So whenever you give folate, you need to give B12. They work together. And what's very important about B12 is that we find kind of what I was talking about with the mitochondria being overtaxed. Mm-hmm. What we find is that, again, we were talking about glutathione being low. So what happens is the systems that try to make glutathione are also overtaxed. And so what we know that it's complicated, but the pathway that makes glutathione is attached to our methylation cycle. So, and we'll talk about methylation. Methylation is the process of making these special molecules that help turn genes on and off, right? You might say, well, all the cells in my body have all the same DNA. How can that be? How does a liver cell know it's a liver cell and an eye cell knows it's an eye cell? That's because some of the genes are turned off. And this is done by methylation. And so if you don't have these, what we call methyl groups, then you can't regulate your genes well. And so your cells aren't going to work right. And so what happens is trying to make too much glutathione, it drains the methylation cycle. So what we're learning is one of the things that helps that, because the methylation cycle is also connected to the folate cycle, is that we give the folate, and where it's connected is where B12 works. So you're able to connect the folate cycle to the methylation cycle with folate and B12 and restore that and allow that to work. It has to work overtime because of the fact that we need that glutathione. And there's other ways of fixing that too, but those are very simple ways because you're fixing 2 things at once. So, folate, B12, those are wonderful things. And then you have to look at where the other deficiencies, are. If it's mitochondria, we use, CoQ10. Very, very, very important because it ends up, we think of CoQ10 as just an antioxidant, but actually it's the wires that hold the parts of the mitochondria together.
Oh, that's a beautiful description.
What we call the final common pathway that makes our energy. It's called the electron transport chain. Though they're
like the streaming lights, the Christmas lights that you're plugging in.
Exactly. That's a great example, right? And CoQ10 are the wires that hold that together. So, but it also acts as an antioxidant. So if the mitochondria isn't working, other things are working, it starts to be used up as an antioxidant, and it can't connect those lights. And then the lights don't work. So, and a lot of people don't feel a particularly like very quick clinical response from it. They say, oh, it's probably nothing, but it's probably one of the most important things that makes our body work.
Fascinating. And again, a lot of these things you're talking about can come from a good quality whole food diet as your starting point and avoiding the ultra processed, which drains that tank even faster. Are there any lifestyle things that you have found that are very helpful for these? Like, and specifically, I'm thinking things that just help their neurologic function, maybe their immune system function, their overall energy and quality of life. Are there some things that you've seen that seem to make a difference, either putting it or taking out of the equation?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that one, sleep. That's one of the first things we look at. You need to get good sleep. Your body does for a third of your life, you're asleep, and there's a reason for that. Okay, and it's not just, and the thing is, it's not just to rest your brain. Everything you learn during the day gets integrated to your brain at nighttime. So it's holding kind of short-term storage, and then it goes into your brain. So if you don't sleep well, you're not going to learn. That's where we find. And of course, we're learning that there's a giant vacuum cleaner in your brain.
The lymphatic system.
That's right, the lymphatic system. So you got to let that work. You got to take all the junk out at nighttime and clean up your brain for the morning. So good sleep, people, people don't value sleep. They don't get enough sleep. They don't get good quality sleep. And it's one of the most important things, and we see it with kids, right? If there's reasons for the fact that kids with neurodevelopmental disorders don't sleep well. And, if you don't sleep well, what do you feel like?
Yeah. Not
and
good.
Of course, if the kids don't sleep, the parents don't sleep either. So you have a whole irritable family.
Yeah.
And of course, the other thing that's so important is exercise.
Good. I love that you're saying that. Yep.
Yeah. And get the kids out there, off the pads.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And that's what I was going to lead into is in this digital age, especially a lot of our neurodivergent populations really love the technologies. They really gravitate towards that naturally, and they're freaking amazing at it. But I'm also concerned that it could be adding more insult to injury because of some of the screen time. And we definitely know the impact of blue light from screens on our mitochondrial function. We know it can really kick up glial inflammation, so brain and nervous system inflammation. It can definitely charge up the system. So I'm curious if you've had any studies, because we also know the impact of those just even in the complexes of our mitochondria. But curious if you've had any studies of direct light or lack of light. So maybe lack of red light, for instance, of not seeing sunrise, sunset, and just being in front of a screen all day and night. If you've done some studies or seen some evidence that may make a difference.
Well, we definitely know that, and this is an issue we find when we look at circadian rhythms.
Yes.
So melatonin rhythms. We use a lot of melatonin because the melatonin cycle is not working well.
In these kiddos in particular, you've also found that.
Exactly. And so there is literature that suggests they're not making melatonin, but it's also sometimes you find their melatonin cycle is just completely dysregulated because they're not in that normal pattern, and also
their rhythm, basically.
They don't have the rhythms, right? And you have to have that body rhythm. And actually it's something I tell parents to take advantage of because many kids, they like their routines. You just have to get them into their right routine.
And do a new routine. And they may fight you on that change to begin with, but if you can put them into a new rhythm.
And everybody gets that, right? You get into unhealthy routines and then you get back into your healthy routines. You stop to forget to exercise, but then when you start, you get into your healthy rhythms. And so those rhythms of the body are so important because they help the body. And unless we think about that, and think about doing all those healthy things, again, exercise helps with sleep, also, as you said, it helps the rhythm of the body, see light, go into dark, and it does a lot of different things. You start to interact with people, you start to get the outside world, and it expands your horizon. So, I think getting out, exercising, being outside is just so important.
So fundamental, and yet we seem so far from it sometimes. It's pretty wild. I've got two major questions for you before wrapping this up. And one of them, as being someone who is so well known and respected in the autism research and publication space, I'm curious for you, what do you think are the biggest blind spots in current autism research and treatment that you think deserves urgent attention?
So one of the biggest things I would say is the idea that autism is all genetic. Okay. And this has slowed things down. So first of all, the reason why there's this mantra that is genetic is because it has a high heritability. And so people have equated, and I have lots of slides where the geneticist gets up there and says, heritability equals genetics. No. Genetics is a type of heritable disorder, but there's many other things that you inherit, including like your culture, right? Your culture isn't you like to say it's in your genes, but it's not in your genes, right? It's what you grew up with.
So the nature-nurture hypothesis plays in here somewhat?
Well, it does. It does. And because of that, first of all, it's not genetic, and it doesn't account for the heritability but I loved when I used to have autism conferences, I'd always invite a geneticist, and then I'd ask one of my pediatric colleagues if they had, drunk the Kool-Aid. They start out by saying that autism is genetic because it's heritable. And they end up saying that when they talk about, they sequenced all these genes and they found out this is the gene. And the reason why this is the gene is because it's a new mutation that isn't inherited de novo. So how you can go from saying that it's genetic because it's inherited and how saying that it's the gene because it's not inherited, I have no idea.
This is happening in cancer too,
I didn't know that.
I mean, we're still calling it a genetic disease, despite the fact that nuclear cell transfer studies long ago debunked that myth. And my assumption is the same thing would happen in the autism space. If you took the genetic hard drive that the nuclei of the patient's, with autism cell and replaced it, you're not going to turn on or off autism.
Right. And I mean, even the studies that have shown that when you have siblings that have genetic disorders, they're different. 60% of the time, they're different genetic disorders. So we've started to talk about, we find out these folate autoantibodies, mitochondrial disorders, oxidative stress. As I was saying, it's in the mom. We find that these things run in families. So they're actually inherited. We don't know how, but they're inherited. I'm sure genetics has something to do with it, but it's more complicated than that,
Yes. Well, even at this autism conference, they spoke to the fact that women with autoimmunity have a much higher risk of having kids with autism. And that one kind of gobsmacked me because it is speaking to, like you said, a non-genetic component and more of an immunologic, inflammatory, microbiome-ish vibe.
Yeah, so we know that now. I mean, really, Dr. Vanderwater from the Mind Institute and her colleagues, I mean, it's 20 plus years they discovered this, that there's these maternal, fetal brain antibodies, so that the mother makes antibodies against the baby's brain, and it crosses the placenta and attacks the brain. And we know that they're there, and they estimate it accounts for about 20% of autism. So this is not genetic. This is something that's going on in the mom. You just have to learn how to change that so the child doesn't have it. So there's a lot of things that are heritable, but they're not genetic. And so that's one of the things I've tried to do in some of my lectures, to talk about these non-genetic heritable disorders.
Interesting. I love it. And what you speak to so beautifully is all the hope that we can do better to support our preconception counseling and cleanup before we even think about being parents in the soup of today. I think that's an interesting piece. And final, I'd love to hear from you. What gives you the most hope about the future of autism care, and where do you maybe see us in 5 to 10 years from now?
Well, I hope in 5 to 10 years, we're going to have biomarkers and treatments. And I think what the hope is, as I see that there's really a lot of parents becoming more educated and understanding more of the fact that autism is treatable, that there are these states, and that they're pushing to get to that next stage. And that's what we're trying to do, is say we have to reframe, autism for a behavioral genetic disorder that can't be treatable to a biomedical disorder where we find out the reasons, the pathways that are causing it that we can modify. So the great thing about, metabolism, why I love it, and also immunology is we can do something about it. We can modify it, and that's one of the things that, I think the genetic mantra has held us back is it's genetic. We can't do anything about it.
You speak to hope creation, my friend. I mean, truly, you give a much more hopeful, optimistic view of what is possible. And for that, I'm grateful. And I know we're going to send a lot of links to this podcast. We're going to share this among our tribe. We hope you share it among yours. This is such an important message to be had. And my hope is that the research you are involved in will continue to be like your legacy of changing how we see, view, and support folks on this journey.
Well, I hope so, because we can do so much. And if we don't, it's going to destroy us. The amount of money it costs to support kids with disabilities, it will break our national budget. But most importantly is not the money, is just to get the kids better so them and their families can live, good quality lives.
Exactly. Oh my gosh. Thank you for bringing that message of hope and that brilliance in your life work. This has been, you've been doing this your entire career. So Doc, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for this work. Thank you so much for continuing this work. And I look forward to hearing more about this in the future.
Well, thank you so much for having me.